Hello everyone, this is Nick again, and I'll be reading a couple chapters in Nobilitas. I think chapter 1 was sort of long, but the next few chapters are only a few pages each. And in part 1, we talked about the idea of aristocracy and divine right in the Greco-Roman world, and Dr. Alexander Jacob described Plato's Republic in a lot of instances, and he was talking about how Plato's idea was that it's good to do good by an individual, but then the state or the nation or tribe or whatever is made up of many individuals, so when you do good by a nation or do good by the group, you're doing good by many individuals, rather so sort of that idea of collectivism, not really in a Marxist sense, because Marxism is the idea of everybody is equal, but Plato's Republic was saying that everybody is different and some people are better than others and have certain skills that are different from other people. And so Plato was saying that what the state should do is find people who are good at a certain thing or have skills in a certain area and then help them to perfect their skills so then they can get to work and flourish, and their skills will benefit the whole tribe and the whole society. So I think that's an interesting concept, but next we'll be getting into the idea of aristocracy in the Middle Ages and feudalism and the idea of Christianity and kingship. So here we go, chapter 2 of Nobilitas. The late Caesars of Rome were even more absolutist than the earlier ones. From Septimus Severus to the Illyrian Emperor Diocletian, the Roman Empire gradually approximated to the Oriental form of despotism. However, the emperors were never isolated dictators, but always ruled with the support of a strong aristocracy. Despite the existence of anti-aristocratic factions which consolidated their influence during the leadership of Diocletian, the aristocracy retained its customary political and social privileges up to the time of Constantine. In fact, ever since Constantine, the aristocracy was established as the natural form of government in the West. Thus the nobles gradually consolidated their power during the course of the first centuries AD. And, as M.T.W. Arnheim explains, quote, "In addition to their self-contained domains, the nobles were coming to control the church, as we can see in the writings of Gregory of Tours. Land and church, the two bases of the Middle Ages. Thus, it is that the rise of Christianity as the religion of Europe in the Middle Ages did not, in spite of its insistence on the equality of men before God, encourage the growth of democracy. Christianity was pro-aristocracy." And there's a footnote here. Constantine's encouragement of aristocratic autonomy was presumably in order to ensure that the still wealthy and influential senatorial aristocrats would not oppose the rule of a leader like himself who professed a new and alien faith, Christianity. End quote. The feudal system, centered on the monarchy, clergy, and the aristocracy, was a fully patrician form of government. In fact, the aristocratic quality of medieval government was due not only to the classical tradition from which it stemmed, but also, in some part, to the medieval veneration of the church itself as a supra-political power. Hence the kings were crowned by the Pope and called the Holy Roman Emperor. The nobility in the Middle Ages was composed mainly of territorial chiefs whose allegiance was to the king. The third class of society was constituted by the medieval guilds, which arose partly from the lay orders of the church. Though this class was plebeian, it achieved a considerable independence and privilege under the royal charters. The fourth class was made up of the agricultural laborers, who were either serfs or yeomen, that is, freedmen. The medieval class system was one directed by the recognition of the differences between the various orders of society, and of the importance of cultivating the capacities of each order to their utmost. Such a system indeed reflects the principles of Plato's political system, even if it did not perfect it in the matter of philosophical statesmanship. The Renaissance did not witness any decrease in the power of the aristocracy either. In Italy, for example, the state of Venice offered a vivid proof of the successful rule for centuries of an aristocracy under the Doges. Similarly, the Florentine Renaissance was due to the dictatorship of the Medici, as Sir John Marryat calls it. It may be pointed out that the Medici family represented a wealthy commercial class and that there was no landed aristocracy worth its name in Florence. but the commercial society of Florence was organized, unlike the commercial classes today, in a system of guilds that were little different from the guilds of the Middle Ages, and their contribution to the civilization of the time was innately different from any contributions that commercial or trade unions may make to society today, for they were ruled by a sense of dedication to their specific, often hereditary occupations, and to the idea of the nation as a whole, rather than by a petty desire to exert their monetary influence on all other spheres of social life as in the modern age. Besides, there was no notion of democracy or universal suffrage, and, quote, the brilliant achievements of Florence in art and literature were the product, not as is commonly represented, of democracy, but of a vivacity of spirit, an alertness of mind, not to say a restlessness of temper, which was as fatal to stability of government as they were favorable to creative and imaginative work. End quote. One of the important defenders of monarchical rule in the Renaissance was the Florentine aristocrat Francesco Guicciardini, who lived from 1483 to 1540. Unlike Machiavelli, whom he criticized in his Considerations on the Discourses of Machiavelli, Guicciardini maintained that aristocratic and monarchical rule is preferable to popular. As he declares, quote, "But if it were necessary to give a city a government either of nobles or of plebs, I believe it would be better to choose the nobles, for as they have greater prudence and good qualities, one may have more hope that they will evolve some reasonable constitution, whereas a people full of ignorance and confusion and possessing many bad qualities can only be expected to overthrow and destroy everything." End quote. The chief reason for the superiority of the prince and the aristocracy to the people is that they are not subject to petty passions such as the latter are plagued by. Quote, "I believe that the people are incomparably more ungrateful than the prince, for their members are busy about a variety of occupations, and for other reasons they understand less and know less than a prince does. As for envy, it arises more easily in men of the people for whom every kind of eminence of birth, riches, valor, or reputation is usually unwelcome. There is nothing they dislike as much as seeing other citizens higher than themselves, and they always want to pull them down. This does not happen with a prince, for he has no cause to envy an inferior, and hence, where the greatness of others is not such as to render him suspicious, it will not be unwelcome to him, and he will not attack it out of malice." End quote. Guicciardini distinguishes kings from tyrants and denounces the latter just as he champions the former. He understands that sometimes nations may be overwhelmed by so much disorder and discord that it is preferable to have a tyrant restore order in the land. However, in general, quote, "anyone who creates a tyranny in a free country and does so from a desire for power is worthy of the strongest condemnation." Such were Caesar, Phalaris, Pisistratus, and others like them, one more infamous than the other, according to whether they used their power more or less cruelly, and whether they were more or less adorned with their own virtues. End quote. Guicciardini is not in favor of hereditary monarchy, since he insists on a wise rule at every time, and this is not assured in case of hereditary monarchy. If it can be ensured that the kings will always rule under the aegis of the law, and the advantage of monarchy cannot be equaled by popular government of any sort. Quote, "For when princes are controlled by law, no one who has written on political subjects ever doubted that their rule is better than that of the mob. Even within a legal system, not only is the rule preferred to this, but even that of the optimates, for a smaller number gives more unity, greater ability, and effectiveness. There is more order in things, more thought and foresight in affairs, more resolution. But where there is a crowd, there is confusion, and in such a clash of minds, where are several judgments, many ideas, many objects, there can be neither reasonable discourse, nor well-founded resolution, nor decisive action. Men are easily influenced by any vain suspicion and any vague rumor. In short, one cannot deny that a people in itself is a treasury of ignorance and confusion. Hence, purely popular governments have at all times been short-lived, and besides endless tumults and disorders of which they were full while they lasted, have engendered either tyranny or the final ruin of their city." End quote. We see that in Guicciardini's condemnations of popular government, there is a firm contrast made between the serene conduct of princes, which is directed by principles, and the chaotic subjection of people to their passions. And in a footnote here, in his Ricordi, Guicciardini gives the example of the fall of the Medici family in 1527, which was followed by the more popular government of the Grand Council, originally set up in 1494, consisting of 1,000 citizens. The latter, since it was lacking in a definite purpose and, quote, varying from day to day in its actions because of the numbers and ignorance of those taking part, had necessarily to return into a tyranny in order to prevent the continual changes of government prompted by the citizens' quarrels. End of footnote. A more forthright defense of the monarchical form of government was provided by Jean Bodin, who lived from 1530 to 1596. In his significant political treatise, The Republique, in 1576, like many of the best absolutists, Bodin starts from the divine law as the basis of the true monarchy, and insists that, like God, whose image on earth he is, the king should be subject to no other person once he has subjected himself to the divine and natural law. Indeed, the distinguishing mark of a monarch is his ability to lay down the law in a land and to be above it at the same time. Quote, "It is the distinguishing mark of the sovereign that he cannot in any way be subject to the commands of another, for it is he who makes the law, for the subject abrogates laws already made and amends obsolete law. No one who is subject either to the law or to some other person can do this. That is why it is laid down in the civil law that the prince is above the law, for the word law in Latin implies the command of him who is invested with the sovereign power." End quote. However, the absolute power of princes does not extend to the laws of God and of nature, since the conditions of the appointment of regents are only such as the inherent in the laws of God and nature. The need of a strong religious foundation for the state is insisted on by Bodin, since it not only reinforces the divine nature of the sovereign's rule, but also helps to keep the state together. Quote, "Great care must be taken that so sacred a thing should not be brought into doubt or contempt by dispute, for such entails the ruin of the commonwealth." End quote. Religious leaders must also act as the censors of the state in order to maintain moral discipline in it. Rather like Plato, Bodin starts from the premise that, quote, "the sovereign good of the republic, and of each of its citizens in particular, lies in the intellective and contemplative virtues." End quote. Thus, it is generally agreed that the ultimate purpose, and therefore sovereign good, of the individual consists in the constant contemplation of things human, natural, and divine. Only a monarchy can ensure the prevalence of harmonic justice, or the distribution of honors in accordance with the merit of their recipients. This, according to Bodin, is superior to the commutative justice typical of democracies, where all are rewarded equally without any discrimination whatsoever, as well as to the distributive justice such as is found in an aristocracy where honors are granted only to persons of quality or high birth. Bodin distinguishes the three kinds of republic: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Of these, the first is clearly the best, since it is a more stable, a more desirable, and more durable form of republic. And, quote, "the best monarchies are those in which there is a right of succession in the male line." End quote. He recognizes that history is a record of recurring patterns of political form, since the progress of state is ultimately connected to the cyclical movement of the heavens. However, the human will is supreme over nature, and in this regard is like the divine will. It is indeed this correspondence between the microcosm and the macrocosm that necessitates the embodiment of the supreme will or power of the land in a single lofty individual, namely the monarch. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. The examples of the Tudor and the Stuart monarchies in 16th and 17th century England confirm the correspondence of high culture to dictatorial and aristocratic forms of government. And the persistence of monarchies, even after the Puritan Revolution and the military dictatorship of Cromwell, emphasizes the inherent English desire for aristocratic government. The most anti-aristocratic movements in the history of Europe have been the French Revolution and its Russian successor. Although these revolutions were apparently triggered by the economic oppression of the poor by the aristocracy, they were basically a result of what Oswald Spengler calls the opposition of the urban elements of rationalism and commercialism. That is, quote, "money divorced from the prime values of the land," end quote, to the powers of the blood and the tradition inherent in the blood. The revolutions were also due to the rise of the megalopolis and its mob of deracinated, dehumanized people. Quote, "These do not feel themselves as attached to either an estate or to a vocational class, nor even to the real working class. Although they are obliged to work, elements drawn from all classes and conditions belong to it instinctively: uprooted peasantry, Literates ruined businessmen, and above all, derailed nobility." End quote. And in the footnote here it says, "The present supersession of the monarchy by the prime ministerial office in Britain did not come about until 1905, that is, after the Industrial Revolution, along with its mercantile mentality, had fully taken over the functions of society. Nonetheless, even today, the unwritten nature of the Constitution of England is a unique reminder of the aristocratic quality of its most important democratic institution." End of footnote. Of the two motive forces of a revolution mentioned above, money gradually surpasses in influence intellectualism, so that finally, as Spengler puts it, quote, "Democracy and plutocracy are the same thing under the two aspects of wish and actuality, theory and practice, knowing and doing." End quote. However, the parliamentary process per se that results from revolutions is only a temporary phenomenon and is destined to disappear. Quote, "When the non-estate, i.e. the people other than the priesthood and the nobility, falls apart again into its natural interest groups, and the passion of stubborn and victorious defense is over, and as soon as the form ceases to possess the attractiveness of a young ideal that will summon men to the barricades, unparliamentary methods of attaining an object without, and even in spite of, the ballot box will make their appearance, such as money, economic pressure, and above all, the strike." End quote. Even before the full establishment of democracy as we know it today, the basic weakness of anti-aristocratic revolution was illustrated by the restitution of dictators like Cromwell and Napoleon after the turbulences of the English and French revolutions. The revolutions themselves were clearly not national movements, and conservative thinkers staunchly opposed the rising tide of vulgarity that these revolutions represented. Among the main defenses of the monarchical and aristocratic tradition produced at the time of the anti-monarchical revolutions of England and France, Hobbes's Leviathan was one of the most famous. Yet, Hobbes's argument for a supremely strong government centered in a totalitarian state is based on the assumption that such a state is the only way to avoid the evils of the state of nature in which men found themselves at the beginning of history. His advocacy of law as measures of expediency within the community is thus negative, insofar as peace is considered to be the only means of preventing the natural state of war among people. Such an a posteriori view of politics is not really a recognition of the intrinsic value of monarchical or aristocratic rule. Besides, unlike the typical aristocrat, Hobbes maintains that all men are equal both physically and intellectually, and that all individuals must safeguard their natural rights and privileges. A doctrine of sovereignty that is not based on the inherent superiority of the man invested with it can easily be transformed into a democratic one, as indeed happened in the writings of Rousseau, who declared that sovereignty should be delegated entirely to the people, as if it were a transferable commodity. Ironically, Rousseau was also concerned in a major way with the natural state of man, and insisted, contrary to Hobbes, that this was a primevally blissful condition to which modern man should endeavor to return. Little did he know that in a couple of centuries his democratic dream would be almost fully realized, and the mindless confusion of nature become the restless ambition of modern man. And there's a footnote. It is interesting to observe in this context that while both France and Russia have had forms of dictatorship, either military or plebeian, following their anti-monarchical revolutions, America alone has had none. This reveals the truly popular nature of American democracy and its complete inability to achieve an aristocratic state. This is the consequence of its relatively recent founding as a nation and its wide separation from the European mainland and the historical and cultural traditions fostered in it. End of footnote. The conservative reaction to Rousseau in the French Revolution showed a more genuine understanding of the natural basis of aristocracy than Hobbes' system did. While Hobbes regarded the state as an institution of expediency, the 18th century English statesman and political philosopher Edmund Burke, who lived from 1729 to 1797, insisted on the importance of piety and tradition in the growth of states, as well as on the organic model of its formation. As he put it, our country is not a mere thing of physical locality. It consists in great measure of the ancient order into which we were born." End quote. And considering the history of Europe, Burke remarks that, quote, "Nothing is more certain than that our manners, our civilization, and all the good things which are connected with manners and with civilization have in this European world of ours depended for ages upon two principles, and we indeed are the result of both combined. and I mean the spirit of a gentleman and the spirit of religion." End quote. Not only is monarchy the ideal form of government, but also the nation must possess a strong aristocracy and religious authority. The lofty spiritual attitude of a natural aristocracy is clearly outlined by Burke thus, quote, "To enable men to act with the weight and character of a people, we must suppose them to be in that state of habitual social discipline in which the wiser, the more expert, and the more fortunate conduct, and by conducting enlighten and protect the weaker, the less knowing, and the less provided with the goods of fortune. To be bred in a place of estimation, to see nothing low and sordid from one's infancy, to be taught to respect oneself, to have leisure to read, to reflect, to converse, to be enabled to draw the court and attention of the wise and learned wherever they are to be found, to be habituated in armies, to command and obey, these are the circumstances of men that form a natural aristocracy without which there is no nation." End quote. Burke's aristocratic theories not only abhorred the excesses of the French Revolution, but also venerated the monarchy, and the House of Lords as the true pillars of government in Britain. His approval of the British Constitution, too, was based on the fact that its being largely an unwritten tradition of customs and precedents, rather than a mere set of parliamentary laws. Referring to Rousseau's famous theory of the state as a social contract, Burke declares, quote, "Society is indeed a contract. Subordinate contracts for objects of mere occasional interest may be dissolved at pleasure. But the state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, calico or tobacco, or some other such low concern to be taken for a little temporary interest, and to be solved by the fancy of the parties. It is to be looked on with other reverence, because it is not a partnership in things subservient only to the gross animal existence of a temporary and perishable nature. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection." End quote. Such a conception of the state can be achieved only with a true regards for tradition. Quote, "As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Each contract of each particular state is but a clause in the great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower with the higher natures, connecting the visible and invisible world according to a fixed compact sanctioned by the inviolable oath which holds all physical and all moral natures, each in their appointed place." End quote. Any changes that are made in the constitution of a land must be undertaken only with the examples of antiquity in mind. Burke thus brought forth the vital importance of a national tradition for the proper government and intellectual cultivation of a people. Besides a strong national culture, a state must have the support of religion, since, quote, "All persons possessing any position of power ought to be strong and awfully impressed with an idea that they act in trust, and that they are to account for their conduct in that trust to the one great master, author, and founder of society." End quote. In a society where freedom from authority is the fashion, the people are less under responsibility to one of the greatest controlling powers on earth, the sense of fame and estimation. A perfect democracy is therefore the most shameless thing in the world. As it is the most shameless, it is also the most fearless. End quote. And there is a footnote here. It's in French, and I don't speak French, but it's a essai sur les principes générateurs des constitutions politiques et des autres institutions humaines On God and Society by E. Grafer and H. Regenery. Meister no doubt had in mind the evidence of the Greek tragedies among other documents. End of footnote. Similar to Burke's view on the origin and function of the state are those of the French aristocrat Count Joseph de Maistre, who lived from 1753 to 1821. Maistre maintained that the source of the state was piety as well as tradition. Examine history, which is experimental politics. There we shall inevitably find the divinity always called to the aid of human frailty. The strength and durability of a nation is, according to him, related in direct proportion to the certainty and stability of its religious feelings. Quote, the most famous nations of antiquity, especially the more serious and wise, such as the Egyptians, Etruscans, Lacedaemonians, and Romans were precisely those with the most religious forms of government, and the duration of empires has always been proportionate to the degree of influence the religious element gained in the political constitution. The prosperity of monarchical rule is a proof of the natural religious instincts of a people, since the rule of a sovereign is an imitation on earth of the divine supremacy. Quote, "Law is only truly sanctioned and properly law when assumed to emanate from a higher will, so that it is essential quality it is to be not the will of all, otherwise laws would be mere ordinances." End quote. Thus, Maastricht insists that the fundamental principles of political constitutions exist prior to all written law. The truly political laws of the land are synonymous with the religious feeling of the people, since, quote, "Man is a free, intelligent, and noble creature. Nevertheless, he is an instrument of God." End quote. Justice is directly related to God. Man, in communication with his Maker, is sublime. His activities creative. The instant he separates himself from God to act alone, on the other hand, he does not lose his power, for it is a privilege of his nature, but his activity is negative and leads only to destruction. End quote. Since true law is a natural and divine institution, it is wrong to reform them, let alone abolish them altogether. Quote, "The essence of a fundamental law is that no one has the right to abolish it, for how could it stand above all men if some men had made it? Popular agreement is not possible, and even if it were, an agreement is still not a law at all and obligates no one unless a higher power guarantees its enforcement." End quote. To follow the doctrines of people like Voltaire and Rousseau would be to return to a state of anarchy and degeneracy. Quote, "And the great tribunals will be delivered into the hands of nameless adventurers, without prestige or fortune, replacing the venerable magistracy in which virtue and learning had become hereditary as the dignities of office, a true priesthood which other nations could envy until the moment when false philosophy, having wisdom from all her accustomed haunts, climaxed these noble exploits by driving her from the land altogether." End quote. Significantly, Meister also considered the state not as an official organ instituted by men, but as an organic form that develops in the course of history with the full force of tradition. To ensure that the revolutionary sentiment does not appear again, Maastricht points to the vital necessity of a sound spiritual educational system. Quote, "For every educational system which does not have a religion as its basis will collapse in an instant, or else diffuse only poisons throughout the state." End quote. Indeed, if the guidance of education is not returned to the priests, and if science is not uniformly regulated to a subordinate rank, incalculable evils await us. We shall become brutalized by science, and that is the worst sort of brutality. End quote. We see in Maastricht's aristocratic theory a modern restatement of the Platonic insistence on the identification of politics with philosophy and religion that we encountered earlier in Bodin, and we shall continue to find similar notions persisting among the finest minds of the centuries following Maastricht's. We may, at this juncture, pause to glance at the political philosophy of the Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico, who lived from 1668 to 1744. Since his La Scienza Nuova, written from 1730 to 1744, represents an original view of historic processes and of the patterns of government in the world. According to Vico, there are three sorts of government, which invariably follow one another through the course of revolutions. The first is the divine government or theocratic state, when everything is dictated by the gods, often through oracular decree. The second is the heroic or aristocratic government, in which all power is restricted to the nobility, who rule under the aegis of the gods from whom they claim descent. The third form of government is twofold and consists of, first, democracy, and then, monarchy. The last, according to Vico, is the perfection of the rule of reason. For in Vico's view, monarchs are not only the true representatives of the people, but also the just distributors of privileges amongst the latter, regarding always the respective merit of each. Quote, "Now in free commonwealth, if a powerful man is to become monarch, the people must take his side, and for that reason, monarchies are by nature popularly governed. First through the laws by which the monarchs seek to maintain their subjects, all equal, then by that property of monarchies, whereby sovereigns humble the powerful, and thus keep the masses safe and free from their oppressors. Further, by that other property of keeping the multitude satisfied and content as regards the necessities of life and the enjoyment of natural liberty, and finally by the privileges conceded by the monarchs to entire classes, called privileges of liberty, or to particular persons by awarding extraordinary civil honors to men of exceptional merit. Hence, monarchy is the form of government best adapted to human nature when reason is fully developed." End quote. Though the three forms of government differ in their choice of a leader, the first venerating the priests, the second the nobles, and the third either the populace or the monarch, the dominating principle in all forms of government, according to Vico, is divine providence. Thus religion is the mainstay of a nation, no matter what its political complexion. Hence he concludes, quote, "If religion is lost among the peoples, they have nothing left to enable them to live in society. No shield of defense, nor means of counsel, nor basis of support, nor even a form by which they may exist in the world at all." End quote. This final reliance on religion in Vico's system of history, it may be noted, is in consonance with the champions of aristocracy and monarchy we have already considered. It is also, incidentally, offers a contrast to a similar cyclical theory of government, propounded by the 19th century German philosopher Oswald Spengler, who based his doctrine on a view of states as organic growths which naturally rise and fall from aristocratic and theocratic forms through democratic and liberal ones to finally dictatorships. That is the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4. The major philosophical systems in Germany from the 17th to the 19th centuries were all increasingly idealistic in their complexion and favored monarchical, authoritarian, and nationalist government. The emphasis placed on the importance of an a priori principle, both in metaphysics and in morality, by Immanuel Kant, who lived from 1724 to 1804, led him to a conception of law which was based on abstract reason and not on nature. For the latter remains only to be dompted by man's unique rational quality. The identification of divine law and natural law that we observed in the earlier thinkers thus is substituted by a purer, transcendental conception of the absolute and of law. The reason that Kant relies on ultimately is not the individual pure reason or mathematical intellect, but the universal moral law itself. And it is this law which should control all of men's petty desires and caprices. Concerned as he was with the categorical imperative that this law instills in man, Kant naturally insisted on the priority of duties to rights. The highest life is one based on the freedom of the will, but freedom, in the German philosophical sense, is not the unthinking democratic freedom to do whatever one pleases, for that is indeed a sign of slavery to one's lower nature, but the higher freedom to act in accordance with the universal moral law. In consonance with his philosophical principles, Kant proposed a supremely powerful state with control of both religious and commercial offices in the country. Kant, it must be noted, was not a feudalist, but his opposition to feudal guilds and ecclesiastical powers was directed merely by a desire to consolidate the unitary power of the state. Thus, in contrast to Rousseau's doctrine of the sovereignty of the volonté générale, Kant maintained that the will of the people still requires physical embodiment in a person who may exhibit the supreme power of the state and bring the idea actively to bear upon the popular will. In other words, the idea of the sovereignty of the unitary state cannot be adequately represented by the general will, but only by a sufficiently worthy individual. Contrary to the current fashion of political thought, Kant maintained that a democracy was necessarily a despotism. Quote, because it establishes an executive power through which all the citizens may make decisions about, and indeed against, the single individual without his consent, so that decisions are made by all the people and yet not by all the people, and this means that the general will is in contradiction with itself, and thus also with freedom. End quote. A truly enlightened state will be organized as a monarchical republic. In this republic, the executive and legislative powers will be clearly separated, and the state as a whole will be constituted by a federation of free states. The prime necessity is, of course, a constitution organized in accordance with the pure principles of right. Such a state is also more likely to unite with other neighboring, or even distant states to arrive at a lawful settlement of their differences by forming something analogous to a universal state. Just as the strife that marked the conduct of people in the original state of nature led to the gradual establishment of society, so too the strife which marks international relations will surely develop into a universal accord with it, which is the rational destiny of the entire natural world. In this process of evolution, even the worst aspects of discord, such as war itself, will serve as providential instruments of the final perpetual peace. The consummation of the Kantian philosophy as pure subjective idealism was achieved in the philosophy of Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who lived from 1762 to 1814. Although Fichte began his career as an enthusiastic supporter of the French Revolution and of democracy, his later writings were marked by an increasing preference for a Platonic philosophical state ruled neither by a hereditary aristocracy nor by the people, but by enlightened scholars. Fichte, like Kant, posited the a priori moral law of the universe as equivalent to the Godhead. Ethics, therefore, must not be geared to the attainment of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, as in a democracy, but centered on the freedom of the will. Agreeing with Kant that true freedom means the liberation of the individual from his lower nature, Fichte also conceived of the state as the instrument whereby external impediments may be removed from the sphere of activity of the individual in order that he may best realize the ethical ideal. The fully rational state must act as a promoter of the higher life and actively encourage the arts. The church should be intimately allied to the state as a symbol of the national ideal. Like Kant, Fichte, in his Staatslehre, repudiated all recourse to the so-called natural law, since nature, or the Nicht-Ich, was, according to his philosophy, a product of the mind, or the Ich, and must not be allowed to interfere in the free activity of the latter. True law, like the moral code, must be derived from the dictates of pure reason, which are eternal and universal. The aim of all society is the ever-increasing ennoblement of the human race, that is, to set it more and more at liberty from the bondage of nature. Just as the aim of all culture is to subject nature to reason, one of the major impediments in this regard is the freedom that has hitherto been granted to the youth to choose their own course of moral action. In order to counteract this spurious freedom, Fichte insists that a new system of education must be instituted which essentially destroys the freedom of will and produces, on the contrary, strict necessity in the decisions of the will. Such a will can henceforth be relied upon with confidence and certainty. Although the divine law is indeed immutable, its manifestation on earth is through a process of slow organic development. As such, it is typically represented in the national consciousness of a people and grows with this consciousness through time. As Fichte was sufficiently realistic to see that the state of the world is not at any time an ideal one, he carefully distinguishes between rational and actual jurisprudence, as well as between rational and practical politics. It is the philosopher who is the repository of the ideal system of law and government, for he alone is capable of fulfilling the requirement that, quote, he who undertakes to guide his age and order its constitution must be exalted above it, must not merely possess an historical knowledge of it, but must thoroughly understand and comprehend it, end quote. We recognize here the same definition of sovereignty that Bodin had offered in his Republique, but applied to a philosopher-statesman. According to Fichte, as to Plato, the philosopher alone apprehends the ideal relations that are to obtain between people within a nation. Quote, the ruler, i.e. the scholar as ruler, possesses in the first place a living and comprehensive idea of the relations of human life which he undertakes to superintend. He knows what is its essential nature, meaning, and purpose. Further, he perfectly understands the changing and adventitious forms which it may assume in reality without prejudice to its essential nature. He knows the particular form which it has assumed at the present time, and through what new forms it must be led nearer and nearer to its unattainable ideal. No part of its present form is, in his view, necessary and unchangeable, but is only an incidental point in a progression by which it is constantly rising toward higher perfection. He knows the whole of which that form is a part, and of which every improvement of it must still remain a part. and he never loses sight of this whole in contemplating the improvement of its individual parts. The ruler in Fichte's view is thus necessarily a religious leader insofar as he, quote, in his estimate of mankind, looks beyond that which they are in the actual world to that which they are in the divine idea, to that which therefore they must be, ought to be, and one day assuredly will be. And he is thus filled with reverence for a race called so high to destiny. He looks upon his vocation as the divine will with regard to the human race. His person, all personality, has disappeared in the divine idea of universal order. And thus is he the most direct manifestation of God in this world. End quote. We note that the comprehension of the indivisible entirety of the ideal realm is indeed the chief prerequisite of a ruler, and that his duty consists in the approximation of his nation to this divine ideal. Fichte's belief in the evolutionary process of the manifest mind, whereby the universal self, or God, becomes refracted into a number of individual selves in order to attain full consciousness of itself, also constitutes one of the earliest attempts to formulate a philosophy of history. The course of human history is a record of the various stages in the development of the self from the unconscious to full self-consciousness. In this process, Fichte distinguishes 5 stages. 1. The epoch in which man is still governed by his instinctual life. 2. The epoch in which external authority is substituted for instinct as the ruling principle of man's social life. 3. The epoch in which men revolt from this authority in a spur of individualism. And 4. The epoch in which men begin to understand the rules of reason and voluntarily submit to them. And finally, 5. The epoch in which reason becomes fully conscious in men as complete moral freedom. In this drama of the moral law on earth, the protagonists are the heroes of history, who in initiating new stages in the political life of men, are acting as agents of the rational world order of providence. The first and last stages of his scheme of historical evolution are mythic and utopian, respectively. The second stage is represented by the period of despotism in ancient history, while the growing involvement of the people in the rule of the state, dating back to the Athenians and the Romans, constitutes the third stage. The fourth stage is the one in which Fichte himself lived, when the rational order of the universe was first beginning to be realized, and the state was in the process of transformation into its final stage when it would become an absolute rational order in the hands of heroes and scholars. Footnote here. Kant had also proposed a view of political history as a progress from inferior to higher forms. See Kant, Idea for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Purpose in Nisbet. Oh, and I also think, this is just me adding something real quick, I think what's interesting is another German philosopher, Friedrich Hegel, Hegel, he also had ideas that history was like linear, going up to like a final point, like an absolute culmination of something. And history was like this epic drama that was heading towards one final destiny. And I think that's really interesting. And I know that there's a spiritual movement called cosmotheism that has the idea that like human evolution is a process of man eventually evolving into God, and the universe is the mind of God, and all these other really interesting ideas. But that was just, I figured I should add something there about that. But to continue, the distinguishing mark of the rational order of politics is the subsumption of the individual in the species, which corresponds to the merging of the individual will in the universal. Quote, the life according to reason consists herein, that the individual forget himself in the race, place his own life in the life of the race, and dedicate it thereto. End quote. The life of the race is identical with the ideal life. Quote, for ideas embrace the race as such and its life. For ideas embrace the race as such and its life. End quote. The sacrifice of personal life and its pleasures for the sake of the idea of the race is the mark of the true hero. Individuals are dependent on the community since no one is complete in himself. The inequalities that nature has instituted in people can be rectified through reason and freedom of will. But that presupposes a recognition of these inequalities and of the impossibility of mastering nature all by oneself. Under such circumstances, the duty of a person is to perfect himself according to his abilities. As Fichte put it in Einige Vorlesungen über das Wesen des Gelehrten, a man must, quote, take up some particular department of nature, with the previous history of which he is perhaps best acquainted, and for the culture of which he is best adapted by natural capacity and social training, and devote himself exclusively to that, end quote. Here we have the philosophic reason of the caste system, which is a sign of all true aristocracies, ancient and modern. Just as relations between individuals in the nation are ruled by the need to respect one another's security, so must the different nations respect one another's sovereignty. The relations between individual nations should be mediated through a world court and a league of nations, which would prevent international wars. Yet Fichte never lost sight of the primary importance of the nation over any vague cosmopolitanism. Human beings can best serve mankind as a whole by complete devotion to their state. Quote, only when each person, left to itself, develops and forms itself in accordance with its own particular quality, and only when in every people each individual develops itself in accordance with their common quality, as well as in accordance with his own peculiar quality, then and then only does the manifestation of divinity appear in its true mirror as it ought to be. Among the nations there are higher and lower ones, and all states were originally created out of the conquest of inferior races by superior ones. Fichte believed that the highest race was that which was later to be called the Indo-European or Aryan race, dwelling originally in Central Asia and in Europe. The German state also reveals a genuinely spiritual quality. Quote, the genuine German art of the state seeks fixity, surety, and independence of blind and halting nature, and in this it is quite in agreement with foreign countries. But unlike these, it does not seek a fixed and certain thing, as the first element which will make the spirit, as the second element. Certain, on the contrary, it seeks from the very beginning, and as the very first and only element, a firm and certain spirit. This is for it the mainspring, whose life proceeds from itself, and which is perpetual motion, the mainspring which will regulate the continuously keep in motion the life of society. End quote. And a footnote, the identification of idea or species with race is reconfirmed by Lagarde, Jung, and Rosenberg. End of footnote. Fichte's nationalism was also based on the exclusiveness of languages, so that one nation had but one major language. The Germans alone have a vitality that the other nations have lost, for they alone possess a living language, quote, which develops itself continuously out of real life, end quote. Among people with such an original language, mental culture influences life, whereas among a people with a borrowed or imposed language, mental culture and life go their separate ways. Although he did not consider race as a sure way of identifying the people of a nation, since they are likely to be a people of different racial backgrounds, speaking the state language as their native tongue, Fichte restricted this tolerance of racial diversity to the European peoples and expressly excluded the Jews from his ideal nation-state. For according to him, the Jews were not and never could be Germans, since they are absolutely incapable of genuine humanity, justice, or truth. They should, therefore, be denied all civil and political rights. If possible, they should be deported to the Levant, their original and proper home. Apart from a linguistic unity, Fichte also envisaged economic independence in his state and complete control by the state of its commercial life. The state was to be organized with an effective centralization of power, which in his later writings he declared to be possible only in a monarchic government. For in such a system, the ruler of the nation will act with greater responsibility, and furthermore, that monarchy is indeed most reliable, which is hereditary. However, in his Staatslehre, Fichte agreed that a hereditary monarchy may in some cases prove to be unworthy, in which case it would be preferable to replace him with another, meaning that oftentimes a king will inherit the throne who isn't very good, and in that case, the actual system of monarchy shouldn't be abolished, but the monarch, the incapable or incompetent monarch, should be replaced with a new one. Don't blame the faults of that one particular monarch on the actual system itself. So, to continue. In all cases, the best must rule. Quote, the civilized must rule and the uncivilized obey. If right is to be the law of the world, End quote. The new monarchs, according to Fichte, will be enlightened scholars. As scholars cannot rule as a group, they should designate the greatest among them as the supreme dictator of the land, who will be responsible for the realization of the inner freedom of each individual in it. In this rule of enlightened scholars, providence will finally be accomplished. End of chapter 4. Alright, thank you very much for listening, and soon I'll do chapter 5. Please subscribe, I'll really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.